Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you briefly about the work that I do as the chair of the Research Ethics Board at CHIO. The board oversees all human research that takes place at the hospital, and we have the authority to approve, disapprove, require changes to research proposals, or stop them altogether. I actually prepared a brief fact sheet, so if I don't do a good job describing it in my talk, I can have a remedial opportunity in the fact sheet. In the fall of 2009, our board approved a study looking at the possible value of arsenic in the treatment of a certain type of blood and certain type of cancer affecting the blood and bone marrow of children, acute myelocytic leukemia, APL. And I'd like to describe this study to you briefly and the process that we went through in approving it. For me, the approval of this study in particular really illustrates the work of the Research Ethics Board quite nicely, and also the balance that we try and strike between protecting patients on the one hand and allowing science to go forward on the other. So let me give you a bit of background. APL is a rare condition that is believed to affect 1 in 100,000 children. The disease was first identified in the 1950s or so. Up until the 1980s, the disease was always fatal. No treatment was effective. And because of these poor outcomes, initial efforts at therapy were very aggressive, very toxic, and in the first instance, very effective. Unfortunately, these favorable outcomes came at a high cost, and researchers and clinicians soon discovered that children treated in this manner were developing sometimes fatal cardiac problems after the fact. So interest in arsenic therapy occurred in the 1970s when physicians in China began to use it in the treatment of APL with adults. To be clear, arsenic is what we believe it to be. It's a poison. It's the toxic ingredient in rat poison. Apparently, it's been used for thousands of years in medicine and many, many years in traditional Chinese medicine. In fact, there's evidence that arsenic may have been used in ancient Roman and Greek societies, and certainly in early Western medicine as well. So the accumulated clinical experience of these Chinese physicians and later systematic studies showed that indeed the drug was surprisingly safe and effective in the treatment of APL. The study at our center was intending to use arsenic in combination with traditional chemotherapy to treat children diagnosed with APL, and that was a first and novel effort. The study has been opened in 5 other pediatric centers in Canada. And what's interesting for me as well is the addition of arsenic is intended to allow for a dose reduction in the traditional backbone chemotherapy. Now, as I mentioned initially, our board approved this study. And let me explain why. Well, primarily we approved the study because we felt that we were given appropriate answers to the following questions. Was there a good basis and good data justifying the use of arsenic to treat this condition in children? Were the problems within existing therapies of such magnitude that a new therapy was required? Were the side effects of the treatment expected in the short and long term to be acceptable? Were they expected to be acceptable? Were most of these side effects reversibles? Which ones were not? Could they result in death? Would it be reasonable to expect a child's quality of life to be preserved? Were there viable alternatives to families? Was there at least a reasonable expectation that the less intensive chemotherapy would still achieve remission? If not, were there effective treatments for secondary or relapsed cancers? Was there a well-designed, robust plan for interrupting the study if the treatment was found to be unexpectedly noxious? Who would be at greatest risk for these side effects? Was that known? Would those who would be at greatest risk of the side effects be excluded from the study? Was the study, with all its strengths and weaknesses, described to families in a way that allowed them to make, as best they could, an informed choice for their children? Now, what's most conspicuous in my mind is the question that wasn't asked, and the question that we never ask at the Research Ethics Board. And that question is, was there absolute and irrefutable evidence that this treatment would benefit children and that they would not be harmed? And quite simply, that question is not asked because the answer is not available. The answer to that question will come at the end of the study when the data is compiled and analyzed. And so the work of the Research Ethics Board is, in my mind, incredibly important, but also necessarily flawed and imperfect. So let me emphasize that last point. Our work is imperfect because children are not just little adults who respond in the same way as do older individuals. What is effective and safe with kids is not necessarily so. Effective and safe with adults is not necessarily so with children. Some side effects that are both rare and catastrophic can only be understood when a treatment is used with a larger number of patients who are followed in the long term. And science is always a step into the unknown. And it does not always move forward predictably and logically. And here I'm not suggesting that scientists don't think predictably and logically and systematically. They most certainly do. But nature doesn't necessarily follow suit and behave logically, predictably, reasonably. And so treatments that differ ever so slightly from those that may have been used previously can sometimes result in very different outcomes. Thank you for your time.